Apologies, Acting President. Acting Deputy President. Yeah, right. I rise as a member of the opposition to give my first speech on the estimates of revenue and expenditure, Consolidated Account Estimates 2025-26, or more simply my budget and reply speech. It was just interesting to hear the discussion around vocational training. I was one who was indentured, and I was indentured in the 80s, not in the Dickens era, as a young sailor who joined the Navy for 9 years. I was also around the same time that shortly after I finished my training through the base that I was put in, that the federal Labor government at the time actually got rid of the military training apprenticeship schemes and got rid of a lot of apprenticeship schemes in favour of what at the time was called the clever country, where someone decided that people having a degree was actually a much more prosperous way for our country to move forward. I think history's shown that's not quite been the case. So it's an honour to be able to give this speech, and I'd like to think that along with my other new colleagues, I come to this chamber with a fresh set of eyes. I do not come into this chamber as an economist, which at first glance at the volumes of budget papers, one perhaps for a moment wishes they were, and I've noticed some of my other learned friends who have made similar comments. And while I would not for 1 minute wish to disparage the profession, I'm somewhat comforted by the words of Lawrence J. Peter, who's famed for identifying the Peter principle, in his observation that an economist is an expert who will know tomorrow why the things he predicted yesterday didn't happen today. And it's through that lens I find myself considering the Treasurer's speech on the WA state budget and the prognostications tied up in the budget figures and statements within. Budgets are interesting things, especially government budgets. I spent much of the last couple of decades in the world of private sector resources projects. Budgets in that world were tied to time-bound outcomes and carefully defined and allocated. They were based on business decisions arising out of broader investment strategies. Every project was weighed up based on the opportunity cost of capital invested, and a finite allocation of funds. Margins were carefully risk assessed, analysed, and almost without exception, there were a few, based on sound financial modelling. So why am I telling you this? As I looked at the budget paper and more generally at the way the government allocates funds, I'm struck by the approach that is taken in the way government allocates spending. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not an economist, but I do understand that the drivers for spending are quite different between government and for-profit entities. The choices that each make are quite different. And this is further differentiated depending on the political and economic philosophy of the government of the day. And I don't think I'm going out on a limb here when I say that individual values and choices, especially at a government level, have profound implications on the fortunes of not only states but entire nations. For instance, one only has to look at the effect the Trump tariffs are having on the rest of the world and the future fortunes of countries affected by them. So what does this have to do with the Western Australian state budget? In the State Treasurer budget speech, the Honourable Rita Saffioti used the terms based on the word invest 60 times. Cases of use varied from things like investment in economic infrastructure to streamline approvals to make it easier to do business in Western Australia, to investment to deliver 540 social and affordable homes, to things like investing to support WA households. In some cases, the words used are reasonably well suited. However, in many cases, they're not. For something to be an investment, there needs to be a measurable return, and that return needs to reasonably outweigh the cost of achieving its stated aims. At the very least, we owe the long-suffering taxpayers of Western Australia that courtesy. I understand that the measures we have as different political parties may be different, and we may ascribe different values to the relative outcomes, but we need to be able to demonstrate it. There are a number of budget items that I and my colleagues struggle to see the clear investment value of based on the expenditure. And as we have seen already, the returns, other than on a performative political basis, are questionable. Not the least of these is the Perth Street Circuit, or what is commonly referred to as the Burswood Motorplex. And it's to this that I refer back to the individual values of members of government and their spending choices that are more rooted in personal preference than in real-world sound financial decisions, that are clearly justified for their actual return on investment or demonstrable societal good. I'd also go so far as to say things like the energy assistance and energy bill relief fall into this category, but I'll touch on that one much later. In the project and operations world, we were constantly held accountable to cost and schedule performance to ensure that the outcomes were as close to those planned at the start of the project as possible, and that the return on investment protected or improved for the shareholders. We were well aware that even though we were responsible at times for massive budgets, the funds were not ours, but they belonged to the shareholders. Even though we compel the people of Western Australia to pay taxes and fund the activities that we control for government, we nevertheless remain accountable to them. So as I look at the recent spending decisions of the government, I question whether that belief is entirely shared. On the 30th of July this year, Shadow Treasurer Sandra Brewer MLA announced that she would introduce a private member's bill for an independent parliamentary budget office. This was recommended by the 2018 Special Inquiry into Government Projects and Projects, and I hope that the Premier, the Honourable Roger Cook, will support such a motion when it's tabled in the Assembly. It might help us all to understand where the tidy $50 million for the hospital maintenance came from and what it would be spent on, among other things. So I'd like to move on to a few specific areas, and I'll kick it off by talking about the AUKUS readiness plans for Western Australia. AUKUS represents the most significant growth and development opportunity that our state has seen in a generation. AUKUS is to 2025 what the mining and oil and gas opportunities were during the governments of Sir David Brand and Sir Charles Court. As alarming as the deterioration of global and regional security is, and we know that that comes with its own risks and challenges, the opportunity to grow and diversify the WA state economy is enormous. The opportunity, however, will not materialise without the sense of urgency required to achieve it. The target work milestones for HMR Stirling and Henderson supporting infrastructure construction projects require clear plans and a roadmap to achieve them in a timely fashion in order to be ready for the submarine rotational force SRF West to be ready by 2027. The snail's pace of things like the major projects like Metronet will not cut it and stand to jeopardise not only the confidence of Australia's AUKUS partners, but also the ability to support the submarine maintenance and naval shipbuilding and sustainment programs that we're about to see. So recognising that the AUKUS program requires action from both state and federal governments, the Western Australian government still has a critical role to play. The June Lowy Institute article, AUKUS, Building Confidence in Australia's Submarine Pathway, by Jennifer Parker, noted that worries are growing in Canberra and Washington that upgrades at HMAS Stirling and the new Henderson Defence Precinct are drifting off schedule. Parker also proceeds to state that from the outside it is impossible to judge progress and partners are openly sceptical. It is hardly surprising given Australia's patchy record on recent naval projects. Repeating that we are doing enough no longer cuts it. If Canberra wants to shore up confidence, it should publish a detailed schedule for the Stirling and Henderson works. Transparency, not talking points, will keep AUKUS on track. Again, recognising that this is not entirely on the WA government, and the federal government certainly guilty in dragging its own heels and creating delays to numerous projects. However, the lack of clarity on the Western Australian planning and lack of detailed milestones continues to make industry and our AUKUS defence partners nervous. And I'm not filled with confidence that the necessary focus to ensure the critical Henderson Defence Precinct and other supporting infrastructure like roads, housing will be adequately addressed in the time frames required when the Treasurer's budget speech contains limited mention of any of the works required to support the precinct and the Western Trade Coast strategy. I just want to point out that as the Commonwealth, there's agreement between the Commonwealth of Australia and the state of Western Australia that the government is expected, and it says that it's expected to, and I quote, lead the planning and delivery of new state-owned common user facilities, infrastructure and capabilities that can support current and future non-defence industries, activities and projects. This is on the state government, not on the federal government. Currently, from what I can see, the project is all strategy and no plan. So apart from $700 million in the budget to widen the Kwinana Freeway, which I'm sure will be welcomed by all those who commute up and down between Rockingham and Mandurah in the city, it's difficult to see a clear plan reflected in the budget given the massive road, power and other services required to support the precinct. In his recent comments in The Australian, Federal Shadow Minister for Home Affairs Andrew Hastie expressed his and our AUKUS partners' concerns that the initial stages of the AUKUS implementation were at risk because WA Premier Roger Cook and the WA Labor State Government has gone slow on it. I share those concerns. With all that said, though, I was glad to read of the measures being undertaken in this budget to support AUKUS readiness, including AUKUS Small and Medium Enterprise Readiness Fund, the Defence Industry Initiative Scheme, and the Defence Industry Skills Centre of Excellence. I note that alongside of this investment in fee-free TAFE will contribute somewhat to the provision of a qualified defence workforce, provided people get through it. However, I do have some serious questions that remain as a result of that. So as far as I'm aware, the criteria for the SME Readiness Fund still remains to be finalised. And it's unclear how many SMEs will benefit from this funding. And in my discussions with people in the defence industry at various events, that's being reflected through as well. So according to the Honourable Paul Papalier during July estimates, he said the funding for estimates will be somewhere in the order of $100,000 or half of the project value, assuming the lesser value of the two. When asked about his response and what exactly the criteria was that it was going to be eligible for those funds, he stated that it's being worked on right now. Again, at the late stages of the game, where the time of execution to critical projects is very short, it seems that there's been a lack of planning and clear foresight when it comes to required timeframes. With 238 SMEs identified according to Labor's own press release, I have to question how many of these SMEs will really benefit from this funding. But as I said, we're still waiting for the criteria to be released, which will doubtless reveal the actual efficacy of this measure. In late 2024, the Economics and Industry Committee of the WA Parliament published a discussion paper on the growing defence industry in WA, which revealed that many SMEs struggle to stay afloat between major defence contracts in WA and confronted by the many challenges due to the ebb and flow of these defence contracts. This, again, in my meeting with many people, small businesses in particular, through some of the defence networking that I've been doing over the past 4 or 5 years, is very much reflected. In fact, there's quite a few who have decided that it's just too hard in defence, it's too risky, they can't sustain their business, so are looking elsewhere. It's also something we've heard from larger primes who have, for the first time in their history, have actually had to start laying off workforce, waiting for these decisions to be made. And again, many of these are federal issues, but there's also state decisions tied to these things. So the delays and cancellations drive uncertainty for the SMEs. And I think there's a lack of understanding at times from the government of just how tight the margins are and just how vulnerable these companies are. Moreover, some major defence primes prefer internationally made parts over WA-made ones. The paper, this is the Economics and Industry Committee paper, stated that without local content requirements, local SMEs will likely be relegated to IKEA-type assembly activities rather than manufacturing critical components to service defence contracts. Strangely enough, that statement reminded me a little bit about the Metronet trains and the Lego-type assembly arrangement we've got out in Midvale. So we're left to question how much of an assurance the SME Readiness Fund really is for SMEs in WA, but I look forward to seeing this eventuate. In the concluding remarks of the Economics and Industry Committee Chair, the Honourable Peter Tinley AM MLA, are quite telling, and perhaps a warning to the current government that a greater sense of urgency is required to ensure success of WA's defence industry, and I believe it's worth quoting. This is the Honourable Peter Tinley. The committee has formed the view, following this brief investigation, that government and coordination challenges threaten to hinder the growth and success of WA's defence industry. Addressing these challenges will require a commitment from both state and Commonwealth governments to establish a more centralised and streamlined governance structure, improve communication and information sharing, and adopt a coordinated and timely approach to infrastructure development and workforce planning. And I did notice in the budget that there is additional funding going to Defence West, which hopefully will help to speed some of these decisions on and get some of these projects moving. Moving on to the Defence Industry Incentive Scheme, we sort of talked a bit about vocational training today. I have some questions that I'm sure will be duly answered in estimates. So in its election commitments section on page 375 of budget paper number 2, the government said that it would allocate $11.5 million to Defence Industry Skills Centre of Excellence which is more or less reflected in the spending changes on the table page over a 4-year period. It's actually 11.85 million, but close enough. We're informed on page 375 that the scheme will provide employers with a $20,000 incentive for 435 apprentices to grow the WA AUKUS defence workforce, which is prioritising apprenticeships for engineering, fabrication trade, mechanical trade, industrial electrician and electrotechnology electrician. So leaving aside questions of the efficacy of incentive payments such as these, we have additional questions of retention, and I refer to the Honourable Steve Thomas's earlier graph that showed that we do have a significant problem there. Furthermore, estimates about the number of people we need to fill the positions generated by Defence vary, and they vary pretty widely. So some estimates estimate that we'll need to grow our defence workforce by 2,500 people for defence shipbuilding, and later estimates indicate 10,000, which would require a 230% growth in the WA defence workforce. So we've got a big discrepancy between what we even really need, and this is from one of the reports that was tabled in, I haven't got the date here. I suggest we may need some more clarity on those numbers, particularly with the recent decision to purchase and build Japanese Mogami-class frigates in Western Australia. I suspect we're actually going to need a much bigger bucket of cash. So while I don't have visibility on the cost benefits analysis on the investment decisions that have been made around the examples above, I do have a much higher level of confidence that the Western Australian taxpayer is getting some reasonable value for money in the spend than many other budget line items. So drilling down a bit more into the details of the road situation around the ongoing ramp up for AUKUS, I want to make particular mention of a particular road in the city of Rockingham. A number of members of Rockingham Council approached me when they heard that I'd been elected, and they were pleased to hear that someone who had a long association with HMAS Stirling and Garden Island access issues and perhaps cared enough to do something about it was now in Parliament. So my staff arranged a visit to meet with them as requested, and I was told by residents that they've been troubled for some time by the passage of heavy trucks through their quiet streets. One of the places in particular is across a roundabout where the type of truck that was going through on a daily basis couldn't actually fit through the roundabout, so I was driving over the edges of it on both sides of the road, in fact, and it's a roundabout that is receiving regular maintenance because the curbs and the bricks around it are being smashed up, and the ground is actually subsiding away from the weight of the trucks coming through. One of the people I met, his house, he had to get compensated because the damage to his house was so extensive from the trucks coming past. They had to do some fairly major repairs to his house.
Order, member. Noting the time, I'll leave the chair until the ringing of the bells.
Members, we are dealing with order of the day number 1, the estimates of review and expenditure consolidated account estimates 2025-26, and the motion is that, the question is that the motion be agreed. The Honourable Phil Twiss.
Thank you, Acting President. I'll just recap where I was before lunch, in case you've all forgotten the riveting details that I was giving you about Rockingham. So I was talking about drilling down into the details about the road around Rockingham, as I was asked by a number of members, the local residents down there and a couple of members of the council to come down and have a look at what was happening and to see, get a bit more detail on the roads down that way and their relationship with the problems of AUKUS that they were having. So where I got to was the discussion about the heavy trucks going through a road that just really wasn't suited to it. I'm getting to that, Honourable Member. I'm getting to that, so I'll resume. So heavy trucks going through a street that's wholly inadequate to take it, and some of those trucks are actually carrying explosives and ordnance to and from HMAS Stirling. So the City of Stirling and the local residents advised me of the inquiry that had been done by the City of Rockingham into projected traffic flows for the future, which were especially related to AUKUS and the impending arrival of the nuclear submarines at HMAS Stirling as part of SRF West. So their calculations are actually pretty concerning. So what they found was by 2030, the study indicated that there would be a queue length from the intersection of Safety Bay Road and Parkin Street of 2.3 kilometres moving towards HMAS Stirling. and by 2040, a queue length of 3.5 kilometres. With the first of the nuclear submarines due to arrive by 2027 and the massive expansion of HMAS Sterling, these figures are likely to be conservative because this study was done a little bit before some of these things were actually fully in place. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, some of the trucks that are driving through the Rockingham, along Parkin Street in particular, are placarded as transporting explosives. So we were given some photographs of a number of the trucks coming through. We were able to clearly see, well, mostly see the placarded loads, because apparently some of the placards, the resident who lives within a couple of metres of this road was saying that sometimes they seem to be partially obscured. Now, whether that's intentional or because the signs need replacing is in question. So what these trucks are carrying is Class 1 explosives, according to the placards. And for those who don't know what Class 1 explosives are, they can be anything from ammunition, blank or live, torpedoes, missiles, warheads, etc., which makes sense for HMAS Sterling. And they're passing within several metres. In fact, I've got a photo, it looks like it's 2 to 3 metres from the corner of this person's house. And these roads, as I said before, are wholly inadequate and they're becoming damaged over time. And there's a potential there. If a truck comes across one of these broken pieces of curb, if it blows a tyre, then you could end up having a truck rollover, a truck accident. And the effect of that would be you'd pretty much have to evacuate a very wide area around that because of the potential for catastrophic explosives. So I'd attempted to ask a couple of questions on notice on this topic, but despite this road being a local and state matter, the emergency response being the responsibility of DFES, end up being advised that the transport of explosives to HMAS Sterling is a Commonwealth issue. I understand that, but the roads are local and state roads. So with this in mind, I was pleased to learn of 3 studies that are actually being undertaken by the Commonwealth into the feasibility of the Garden Island Highway, which, if they're actually actioned, will alleviate the traffic burden that's looming over those streets. I was less pleased to hear the response to the Honourable Steve Martin's questions without notice to the Minister of Transport from Tuesday, the 24th of June 2025 on this study. Indulge me, I'll read it out now. So, Honourable Steve Martin to the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Transport. I refer to the AUKUS Link Garden Island Highway feasibility study to be conducted by Main Roads Western Australia announced by the member for Rockingham. 1. Has the study officially commenced, and if so, on what date? 2. Have the Commonwealth and Western Australian governments completed a formal agreement outlining the cost-sharing funding arrangements for the study, including the $2 million annual budget allocation? 3. Which consulting firm or contractor has been appointed to conduct the environmental, heritage, constraint mapping and road infrastructure components of the study? 4. According to the member for Rockingham, the study was to begin in early 2025, with completion expected around late 2025. Is the project still on track to meet that timeline? 5. If any delays have occurred, what are the causes and revised expected completion dates? And the Honourable Samantha Rowe replied, and with the following answer on behalf of the Minister for Transport. 1 to 5. Main Roads Western Australia, as requested by the Federal Government, is undertaking preliminary assessment of the road network in Rockingham and is currently liaising with the Commonwealth Department of Defence and providing input as required to the studies related to the future access requirements for HMAS Sterling. And I suspect you may agree with me, Acting President, that was hardly an answer to the Honourable Member's question. So I failed to advise him of the study's commencement date, the cost or funding agreement for the study, the project timeline or any delays. And in my conversations and my time down in Rockingham, I believe the people of Rockingham actually expect and deserve better than that. So rounding back to my starting remarks on this section about my long association with Garden Island access issues, it was back in the mid-90s when I was posted to ships based out of HMAS Sterling that I first heard about the Garden Island Highway proposal. And I remember very clearly back then that mornings when you're coming on the base or leaving the base, it was congested even back then. It's staggering to me that 30 years later, the situation still hasn't been resolved and the people of Rockingham still live with not only the inconvenience of an inadequate critical road, but the much elevated risk of heavy trucks and explosives on their doorstep. It frustrated me then, when I lived in Rockingham, the way that the people of Rockingham were taken for granted by Labor members simply because it was a safe Labor seat. So I'm thinking now that if something should have been, it should be a budget line item, that should be one of them. So before I leave WA defence issues, I wish to point out another line item that I would have expected to start showing up in the budget papers and forward estimates. And this is a provision to prepare the key hospitals for the specific requirements of AUKUS, and in particular dealing with nuclear medical incidents. And I have asked questions on this as well. I understand that the current hazmat response based on visiting nuclear ships has been signed off by the Australian Nuclear Powered Submarine Safety Regulator, which is newly formed, and their powers will actually come into force on the 1st of November this year. So it's been signed off as an interim measure until SRF West arrives in 2017. I asked a local nuclear expert about this, who's deeply involved in the plans of rolling out the requirements under the safety regulations under the Act. He was surprised that had been allowed for, but he said that's what it is. So I understand that it's not until 2027 that the hospitals and our emergency response system will need to be updated to that, and we're still using the visiting nuclear ships protocols. And I'll have more questions to follow on this issue in due course in the coming year or so. And I think this is a particular note given the loss of confidence that's now emerging through the government's management of the hospital system and infrastructure. I'd like to briefly touch upon housing, as housing touches upon the lives of so many of us. So in 1996, my wife and I built our first house in Warnbro for under $100,000, which in today's money would be roughly $200,000. It took us 3 months to complete construction and move into our home from the time the slab was put down. Today, the average build time of a home is around 17 months, according to Master Builders Australia. Embarrassingly, for Western Australians, this is 2 months longer than South Australia, which is the next worst state in the nation. And it's an inglorious title that we've held since 2022. And it's incidental perhaps, but this was around the same time that the Metronet project started furiously laying track across the state, or across this metro area. In July 2024, the Bankwest Curtin Economic Report stated that between 2016 and 2021, the residential construction industry in WA had shrunk, while in the rest of Australia it had grown by 14.5%. From 2016 to 2021, Western Australia had an average build time that hovered around 9 months and had kept close enough to that since around 2010. The problem is that in the context of a shrinking construction workforce, the Labor government embarked on the massive and ever-expanding construction exercise of Metronet, which not only drew skilled workers out of other industries, and I know this because I was working in other industries that were struggling to get the types of people we needed, and drove up their wages and created severe stress on their businesses as well. So it not only drew out skilled workers out of the industry, including housing, but it also artificially inflated construction wages through that time in order to meet their already horrendously late deadlines and politically driven completion dates. And I know that as well because I was working for a company prior to entering Parliament that was under that pressure to complete projects that were awarded very late. The award values were so high that companies were happy to take them on, but it created extreme stress, even to the point in which we had a medical issue where someone had to quit work for 6 weeks and ended up leaving the company as actually the founder's son because of mental health issues as a result of working on one of those projects. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily related to the government's fault, but that was the sort of pressure that was being put on these local government infrastructure projects prior to the 2025 election. So the budgeted fee-free TAFE courses for trades and group training organisations' wage subsidies will potentially improve the pipeline, and we had an interesting discussion on that earlier. That says that maybe that's not going to be the case, but the reality is it's still a pipeline. So it's a pipeline that will have a limited impact for several years, when what we have now is a housing crisis right on our doorstep today. Again, it's another program that the government's late to the party on. So the quick fix solution to the government and its budget is to incentivise trades from other states and overseas. which according to an article from John Davies from the Australian Construction Association, he said the incentive scheme is an unsustainable quick fix that doesn't really add any new workers to the overall Australian economy, but it does add to already significant inflationary pressures. Again, this year in June, the Bankwest Curtin report wrote a report for the housing affordability in Western Australia, a long way from home report. It raised some serious concerns for the ongoing state of the housing market in WA. So despite the government being anxious to celebrate WA delivering 20,000 housing completions in 2024, it's still well short of the 4,000 required according to the implied housing accord target. And with 2.4% population growth in the past year, housing is likely to remain heavily constrained. And even with the 45% increase in building approvals, will take quite some time to catch up due to the exceptionally long build times. So yes, Western Australia has a great big shiny new rail system. And yes, many people will be pleased to see the improvements that it brings, including me. Some of the roads that I travel down, it's improved them. It's great. But again, what is the cost benefit of such an encompassing project? And perhaps more importantly, what has been the opportunity cost? Especially for our younger generation and less advantaged who now struggle to find their own home. I'll very briefly just move on to household energy, items mentioned in the Treasurer's budget speech. One thing that always intrigues me in the same breath is that Labor governments in particular, federal and state, are able to say such things as, quote, working together with the Albanese government, our combined policies will see tens of thousands of Western Australian families having access to cheaper batteries and therefore permanently lower energy bills. And this is at the same time as announcing cash and power bill credits, so this is state and federal. Either renewable policies are lowering energy bills or they're not. With plans to shut down coal and replace it with renewables at a time of volatile and uncertain local gas markets, Western Australia could be in for a rough ride. Numerous businesses and individuals are already investing in their own backup power generation to avoid blackouts. And I live out in the Perth Hills, and we know that there's quite a few people out there already doing this and have been for quite some time. So this should be unthinkable in a nation like ours. So according to Tim Gregory in his new book, Going Nuclear, this guy is he's actually arguing from an environmental perspective. And if you can pick up the book and have a read of it, it's actually a very, very useful book and very helpful. So he says energy use and national wealth are tightly correlated. Developed nations with low energy needs do not exist. Human progress and energy consumption are lines drawn in parallel. If we're going to change the way that we generate electricity in this state, then we need to be able to generate sufficient energy to keep growing. If we can't, then we've got to really rethink that. We need to be careful not to sabotage our security, economy and way of life for the sake of arbitrarily drawn lines in the sand when it comes to energy. So I'll leave it at that and I'll move on to firearms. So given my focus of the past year or more, it'd be remiss of me not to touch on the firearms buyback and the rollout of the 2024 Firearms Act and regulations. And it is on that I particularly want to talk about the cost, benefit and opportunity cost of government policy. Over the past months, I've had the opportunity to speak to many people, most very upset they're being singled out by the government simply for the hobby they chose, the interest they had, the tools they needed for their job or their chosen sporting community. People would often ask why it was that the police minister at the time and the Labor government was so adamant to take their guns away. The official answer was, and it is, that we're keeping you safe. It's a fair answer if true, but even being kept safe has a cost benefit attached to it. And I know I'll probably cop heat at some point for this. But the reality is, after all, we take part in a very risky business of driving around almost every day. But we don't find ourselves banned from doing so except in extremely controlled circumstances. So let's look at firearms. In October 2023, the WA Police Union produced the Firearms Trends in WA report. And in this state, it included figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and a number of other sources. One of the data sets includes the number of victims of crime in which a crime was committed but not involving homicide. The rate of assault, which includes just threatening behaviour as well, and robbery victims has declined significantly since 2008. So assaults fell to 21% of the 2008 levels, so essentially a fifth, and robbery has fallen to about a third, so 31% from 2008 to 2022. Firearms deaths are a relatively small component of deaths from other causes. It's 0.25 out of 100,000. And the data indicates that licensed firearm owners themselves are only responsible for a small minority of those homicides. The vast majority of firearms deaths, it's around 80%, are suicides. And many are linked to mental health issues and substance abuse. The government says it's prioritised mental health support in this budget. And commendably, there's $1 million allocated to mental health and suicide prevention program support fund. There's also $12.4 million committed to establishing a residential rehabilitation and low medical, alcohol and other drug withdrawal service in the Great Southern. In the Kimberley, a further $10.8 million has been allocated, including $6 million in capital funding for Derby Wellness Centre and $2 million to progress a withdrawal service in Broome. So these investments into mental health and drug rehab are important, especially in the regions where most of the suicides actually happen. But when you compare them to just the $44.9 million allocated over 5 years to the firearms licensing and registry system, and that's not counting the number of buyback schemes along the way, a clear question starts to emerge. And the question is, are we investing in the right areas to save lives? Even if a small portion of that $44.9 million were redirected to expanding suicide prevention, mental health care and drug rehab services, especially in the regions, the impact would be tangible, lasting and life-saving. It'll be interesting to see yet what happens, whether all this massive amount of money spent on firearms is actually going to give you tangible, lasting and life-saving results. So we must ask ourselves, is it more effective to compensate law-abiding citizens for surrendering firearms, or to invest directly into support systems that prevent people from reaching the crisis in the first place? And finally, I'd like to raise the curious issue of illegal and manufactured firearms and police priorities. And I'd refer to the recent sentencing of Taylor Michael Gorskos with drug, cash and firearms offences from the freeway money incident last December. People remember that. So Gorskos was convicted of possession of prohibited drugs with the intent to supply, and he was caught with 50.8 grams of cocaine, which is a pretty significant amount. Possession of stolen or unlawfully obtained properties, $8,000 cash, and participation in a firearm activity that was not authorised by a licence. And according to the West, the police found 2 3D printers in the kitchen and garage, printing parts for a semi-automatic pistol calibre carbine, whatever that is, and these were discovered in his house, which was searched over a month later. According to the West Australian News dated 5th December 2023, Police Commissioner Cole Blanche was reported as saying on Talkback Radio about the Gorskos arrest, the fact that we've found drugs and the fact that we've found lots of drugs would lead most reasonable human beings to suspect that there was some type of transaction going on the side of the freeway. Fair enough. So this clearly indicates that even the police considered this to be a fairly significant drug transaction. Now, this makes it even more curious as to why they didn't act earlier in searching Gorskos's house, when less than 2 months earlier the police had raided a 36-year-old man in Duncraig with drugs and cash offences, and along with that he had 21 counts of illegal firearms possession. And included in that were 14 fully operational 3D printed guns, plus 3D printers, parts and ammunition. There's some big questions there. So having had conversations and heard numerous accounts where police, including sometimes the TRG, have turned up in large numbers to the houses of licensed firearm owners who have fallen afoul of a technicality with the overly complicated and confusing firearms regulations, it does cause me to question, again, what is the cost benefit of the heavy-handed and extremely expensive implementation of the 2024 Firearms Act? What real value have the people of Western Australia received from the many tens of millions of dollars spent? So as I conclude, government budgets are about investments. The return on investments is not necessarily easy to define, but we owe it at least to the taxpayers to do our best. We also owe it to the taxpayers to be honest, and no matter how tempting it may be to allocate funds for vanity projects, performative spending, or good old-fashioned pork barrelling, we must resist. So I hope that the Cook government, in good faith, throw their support behind the Shadow Treasurer's private member's bill for an independent parliamentary budget office. And my parting thought is one that many of my colleagues have already stated before, that the Cook government have been the recipients of incredible good fortune, but we should be preparing for a state in the future in which the fortune is not so great. As Joseph Stiglitz said about the economic crisis of 2008, which I'm sure most people in this room remember, The only surprise about it was that it came as a surprise to so many.